For centuries, human progress has been met with all kinds of obstacles as we push further out into wild places around the globe. Whether it's into the mountains or into the prairies of this vast country that is the United States, we're faced with some very serious issues about how man interacts and lives with the environment. This film aims to tell a story that's as old as time. It's a story about how we humans clash with the environment around us in the pursuit of progress. We're going to talk to experts in the fields of biology and ecology and people who are trusted with the protection and the management of wild species such as wolves and mountain lions and bears. We're also going to talk to those who lobby for hunting and ranching and recreational rights, and we're going to hear what their perspectives are. We're also going to talk to people in industry who are often on the front lines of the controversy, dealing with the aftermath of policy that is made hundreds of miles away from their reality. Whether you're in a living room or a classroom, whether you're in the Western United States or another part of the world, the goal of this film is to generate conversation, to begin a new dialogue that brings us to more effective and better outcomes for everyone.
Well, if you look back into what the Native Americans, how they regarded the ecosystem and the predators who ran around on it, they held them in high regard.
When the Creator made the world, it was a perfect world, and everything worked together in order for the world to exist. The fish, the birds, all the other forms of life were here before man. And so they enjoyed what the Creator made for them.
They essentially revered these animals. They saw things that in those animals that they wanted to emulate in themselves.
And they got along with the animals. And part of that equation was respecting predators.
They saw strength and they saw power there, and they saw, something beautiful, essentially. I think people still very much feel that connection.
And so when man was created, we were put here as helpless beings. And so we came to rely on the animals because they were created first from one Creator. And what impacts one of creation's children impacts the other children.
We are such a small part of that history of this area. And we have very strong feelings in that short period of time. And the feelings that the First Nations, the Native Americans had, that they gained in a very big period of time, is something we should actually respect.
At one time, wolves were all across North America. And then essentially, we removed them from all of the United States.
It was a different time. We know a lot more now than we knew back then. The government was actually paying bounties for people to kill wolves because the idea was we were settling the West. And as we brought cattle across with the European settlers, wolves were looked at as being competition. People were afraid of them.
There definitely was a very focused effort to eradicate all the predators, not just wolves, but all the predators from the landscape.
There was a giant movement to get rid of these animals. These bloodthirsty killing machines as neighbors is not a good idea. We as humans find this way to eliminate the things that we're afraid of, and sadly, the North American grizzly was one of them.
Many of the big predators were hunted to near extinction, but it wasn't so much hunting. It was a concerted effort to eliminate these predators from the landscape. in order to reduce the depredation attacks on livestock.
By the 1920s, I think the last wolf was killed in this area, and there were no more wolf packs on the landscape here. And actually that happened throughout the United States. They killed bears, they killed cougars, they didn't completely eradicate them, and so those animals kind of rebounded on their own, whereas of course with wolves they did reintroduce them to this area.
It was mainly just human persecution and competition and fear that extirpated them.
Beaver were nearly trapped out in order to meet the demand for hats and various other fashion needs, I guess, for folks primarily in Europe and on the East Coast. Many of the waterfowl populations, for example, were wiped out for the sole purpose of creating designer hats. That came about as a result of the market hunting. There was a great demand for that sort of thing.
We've lost, in terms of the last century, several big predators due to extinction, and one of them was the Tasmanian tiger. Another one that comes to mind is the Mexican grizzly bear in the southwestern United States.
We're losing species at a very fast rate. Scientists believe the rate of species loss is 1,000 to 10,000 times the background rate.
Which is the rate of extinction that would happen naturally if we weren't influencing it. And that's going to have dire consequences.
Species have always gone extinct, but what's happening now is that they're going extinct at a much faster rate.
You're talking about fundamentally undermining all of the ecosystem services that biodiversity provides human communities. And we're talking about clean water, clean air, waste management.
Ecosystems do things for us. They clean our air, they reduce flooding, they pollinate our crops. And ecosystems are essentially, they're made up of species. Species are the parts that make up ecosystems. A majority of our medicines come from species, from plants. All of our foods, all of that stuff comes from ecosystems. So as we're losing species, it indicates that the whole integrity of the planet and of ecosystems is declining. That's a cause for concern. It should be a cause for concern for all of us. It's something that's irreversible as well. So once a species goes extinct, there's nothing that can be done.
There are more and more humans every day and less space for the wild animals to call home. We're sharing that space.
We've kind of encroached upon their habitat, and so now they are basically out there trying to make a living, trying to be, like wildlife basically is.
Informing the hundreds or even millions of acres of land to feed the people, we've destroyed habitat for animals.
We modify the landscape. Agricultural habitats create lots of opportunities for predators and prey.
One of our primary impacts on movement of wildlife is just development, just roads and cities and agriculture. All of those things change habitat and push wildlife essentially out of their habitat.
These animals are adapting, they're evolving to that relationship, and people are a little behind. You study predators, it's not black and white. It's like humans. They're all individual personalities. Different interactions change the way they are and how they interact with certain animals.
Bears and cougars and wolves are quite different in their foraging strategies. That is to say, how they gather their food. Cougars are ambush predators. They lay an ambush, they wait for the prey to come near them, or they stalk the prey and get close to the prey without being noticed that they are there, and then use a short burst of speed or possibly jump to the prey species to surprise it. Wolves are completely opposite of that. Wolves are actually cursory predators. So what they do is they make themselves wide open. They come out into a meadow and they announce literally to their prey species that wolves are here. We are here, notice us, look at us. They want to startle that herd. They want to run that herd. And by doing that, then they can choose the most vulnerable out of that population. Bears, they're opportunistic. They're really the epitome of opportunistic. They sort of meander along and they're smelling everything in their environment. A lot of times it's a surprise between both the bear and the humans that all of a sudden we're in close proximity to them. Predators require a large amount of territory in order for them to exist on the landscape, simply because their prey, their food source, is much more scattered than, say, vegetation for the herbivores. As humans have encroached on their territory, their land space, predators are now sort of in a crunch to find enough prey, and that sometimes brings them close to humans, and that obviously turns into problems for both humans and for the predators.
And when you have areas of a lot of wilderness that butt right up against the city, you're going to have those animals coming inside the city limits.
We're seeing more interactions. Here in Washington State, you look at all the beautiful country we have around here, and sometimes you feel like you're in the middle of nowhere, but one of us actually pulled up a residential layer one time and found out there's no place in Washington that you can be where you're more than 20 miles from a house.
I don't think folks want wolf packs in urban areas. I don't think folks want grizzly bears in these areas either. Black bears, mountain lions. We remove mountain lions all the time from downtown Boise. We just have to.
Bears getting into garbage cans, bears coming into gardens, because the space where they used to find food for themselves is now occupied by people.
Cougars are definitely sighted more often. We have more reports of death and damage and interaction in rural residential and urban areas.
Our cougar population has more than doubled since 1994. And because of that, we see them showing up in southeast Portland. These are not, new urban areas. These are existing urban areas for many generations. They're showing up in large urban centers largely because there's so many cougars in other areas of the state. They're a very territorial animal, that they're pushing the younger animals to find new territory where there aren't male dominant cougars right now.
The reason that there's cougar now being killed around Portland is because of the people's problem. We're invading the cougar country. You look on the bounty records and it's going to tell you where these cougar are. There never was a cougar ever there. People's lived there for 100 years. Now the cougars come into the people because there's food there. There's dogs and cats and whatever. Once you get people integrated into it, there's no such thing as balance in nature, because we provide an unbalanced food source for ourselves that they want to utilize. That's where the rub comes in.
Of course, you've got to remember that the wild animals were here first. In regards to animals like coyotes, for quite a long time now, they've had an ability to basically adapt and become urbanized and survive in urban environments. And the reason they're doing that is because as human beings, we've through our garbage and feeding pets outside and other attractants, we've basically attracted them into these areas for an easy lunch. In regards to animals such as, say, cougars or black bears, oftentimes we inadvertently attract those animals by, say, feeding deer in our backyards with alfalfa or putting salt blocks out, things like that.
Once you have human development that's relatively high density, it's really difficult to have large predators or even large ungulates, elk for example, in people's backyards. They just don't do well.
And houses are pushing out into wildlife habitat that was occupied by bears and cougars in particular. We are seeing more incidents of people and these carnivores coming across each other.
We're fragmenting them. There's no continuous forest left in the lower 48s, with a few pockets of exception in Idaho and other parts of the Northwest. As we continue to fragment this ecosystem, that really disrupts the wildlife, not just predators, but all wildlife. But predators being the top of the food chain are more susceptible to disturbances within their ecosystem. Ultimately, I think humans are thriving on the landscape, and pretty much all other wildlife is just surviving on the landscape at this point.
We have to look at it in another way too, that what happens in nature is probably inevitably going to affect us as human beings.
Whether we're aware of it or not, many of us come out of cultures of bias and prejudice that sometimes keep us from making wise decisions rooted in fact and in science.
There are many myths that have been perpetuated by apex predators based off of a lot of fairy tales that have come from like the Dark Ages, medieval times, that show predators in a very dark and a very evil light.
We had all kinds of fables and stories around wolves, like werewolves, you know, or Little Red Riding Hood.
That they're bloodthirsty, that they kill for sport, that they kill more than they eat, that they enjoy maiming their prey or something like that.
They think that cougars are going to jump through their windows and eat them in their beds. They think that a grizzly bear is going to track them down and, you know, devour them.
There is this thought that wolves will kill a cow every single day of the year, or that they are, you know, these vicious animals that lurk in the woods and they have to be killed and exterminated.
Another myth that's common with wolves is that they will explode in population, and unless we heavily kill them, that we'll have them in our backyards eating our children.
People have taken a little bit of information and then stretched it. Everything from wolves carry all these diseases that are going to decimate humans as well as our pets and those kinds of things.
Unfortunately, those stories have continued on today, and it's perpetuated by a lot of the media, a lot of films and movies and stories you hear about all the time. And it's unfortunately not based on the actual facts and the way the animals truly behave.
The biggest myth when it comes to predators is the fact that we're on their menu. Because the truth is, they don't want to eat us. They're more afraid of us than we are of them. And you know, when you have that fear in your heart, and that's the way you understand predators, it is one of those things like, why would you protect something you're afraid of? It's the very myth that really is the thorn that's causing this misunderstanding of them.
Predators tend to invite controversy, and there is often information put out on both sides that is not accurate.
Humans have an emotional response to carnivores. Either you love them or you hate them.
We hear about them, it's because they've done something wrong. You know, they're on the front page of the paper, you know. Wolves kill 150 sheep. Grizzly bear mauls a hiker. You know, that's our perception. They're big clowns. They're curious creatures. They're emotional. They have strong family bonds. They're not out there killing people. That's not what they do every day. Not the big teddy bear, not the big killer, but somewhere in here. And that's important if we want to live with wild animals. But they're also resilient. You know, they did get driven into the mountains and went to the most remote places that we have on this continent. And those pockets of bears are what have blossomed back into what we know as the grizzly bear population today.
I think that's why it gets emotional, because it does kind of permeate a person's being, if you will, when they feel so strongly and so passionate about their values. So if you're an advocate for large carnivores or for wolves, then you kind of see this as a battleground for are we going to be successful at maintaining large carnivores on a broad landscape. But then if you're in a rural community and the rural way of life and being imposed upon by government and others who don't live and don't do what you do, and maybe don't understand what you do or don't support what you do, so then they're fighting for their way of life. And so I think that's where the emotion comes in.
Every human that is involved with these wild animals, they do have a right to have what they need. It's just compromise. And you know, you do find that a lot of thought on either side sometimes is inaccurate, and it comes from ignorance. And you can't blame those people for being ignorant about wildlife issues. So it's why it's so important to educate both sides. And I really do believe if you give them that opportunity, people the gift of knowing and understanding, they will meet in the middle and there'll be respect.
The choices around how we as human societies are going to relate to and coexist with other species on this planet are just intensifying.
One of the reasons I think we're so polarized is we all have our own information channels. You figure out what you want to hear and you can reject the rest of it. We also live in a very political environment right now. We don't agree about predators, we don't agree about immigration or some of these other big issues. It just seems to carry in very strongly into the predator kind of world.
Demographically, what you usually see is the people that tend to love the carnivores usually don't live near the carnivores. Whereas the people that are living near them, such as ranches and stuff, usually respect carnivores because they know it's hard to live on the landscape, because that's how they live.
Rightfully or wrongfully, a lot of times we blame the other side for the impacts. There are definitely things that we like to work together on, or we wish we could, but because of barriers over those polarizations, we can't.
And it's really quite sad because I think there's a lot of common ground that can be reached to bring these two groups together.
It's also a misunderstanding from humans too, not understanding why the carnivores are there to begin with, what their role is in the environment.
I think if people respect the opinions, even if they don't agree with them, that can help with the working together and trying to find some sort of middle ground that people can agree upon.
Tradition among families is a very important part of culture. So that's difficult for us to break through.
And I think at some point we just need to put our differences aside and look at, we're just people here on this planet. We have extreme passions on one side or the other, but if we could look past that and look at the person as an individual and then look at what's important for our future, I think we can come to a common ground and a common understanding.
It's hard to say whether or not there can be harmony because then you're talking about deeply held beliefs by people. Getting people to change beliefs that they hold very dear to them, that they feel very strongly about, is very difficult.
We'll put together large working groups of people like the agriculture community, whether they're ranchers, farmers, loggers, along with urban, residential, conservationists. We put them all together and bring the science with us to try to find out all of the issues that are out there so that we can address them one by one. What's important is to bring people who are open-minded to these discussions. It takes a long time and it takes a lot of effort. It can be stressful, but ultimately we have to find people that are willing to understand other people's viewpoints and then work together to try to figure out a solution, because a person who comes in closed-minded, who has no opinion but their own, is not going to be helpful.
Predators in particular are very important to ecosystems. They create a phenomenon that's called trophic cascades.
I think ecologists have always known that ecosystems are connected in various and multiple pathways. That's been out there. And there's been a lot of work showing energy flows bottom up. And so energy moves, let's say, from plants to prey to predators at the top. But at least for me, one of the interesting things of our research has been is that we're finding that ecosystems may also have this very important top-down structuring that takes place. Species that seem to be doing this are these apex predators. They begin to affect everything below them. I shouldn't say everything, but they have huge impacts on what's happening in our ecosystems from the top down.
What we now know from the reintroduction of wolves to Yellowstone National Park, for example, is that wolves have a profound impact on the landscape by causing ungulates like elk and deer to move more frequently because they are aware of the presence of predators. They're not just going to sit by the banks of a river and chew on, whatever vegetation they may find.
When you remove or displace the apex predator, the large herbivores, native large herbivores, elk or deer, essentially take over herbivory. Browsing rates go up and woody plants begin to go into major decline. This decline is followed where we have rivers and streams. We see bank erosion taking place, we see channel widening, high levels of erosion, and incredible impacts to rivers and streams.
Each species of animal has their own order that they follow, and that order harmonizes with the life around it.
There was a realization that eliminating predators from the landscape from an ecological standpoint has a very big impact. They've seen changes to the way that the rivers are working, changes to the plant life since the return of the wolves.
If we were to remove predators from this planet, you would see a humongous imbalance in nature, which would create kind of a domino effect of things going out of whack and eventually things going extinct. Too many plants, too many animals that eat those plants, it would just go way out of whack, and eventually it would come in and affect us in a very big way.
And there have been some good documented studies showing, if you increase prey populations, predator populations will also increase, and then when prey populations fall, you get decreases in predator populations.
Especially apex predators provide a balance to nature just through the way that they interact with their prey species, and that's what we've seen not just with wolves in Yellowstone National Park, but with other top predators. Everything within an ecosystem is connected. All those parts go together. And so when you start removing animals such as a top predator from the ecosystem, they'll call those predators a keystone species. When you remove that, then you start to see the rest of that fall apart and change. Those keystone species influence not just their prey animals, but how those prey animals behave, how those prey animals influence other parts of the ecosystem.
There's this huge cascading effect that takes place when you allow an ecosystem to remain in a state that it was intended to be. When you remove predators, you see that cascading effect go in the opposite and reverse direction, which is detrimental to the health of the environment, which we as human beings have the ability to make sure that doesn't happen by properly managing our wildlife in ways that make it so that our environments are sustainable, are healthy.
When the apex predator disappeared, the ungulates began to browse more heavily throughout the system, and so those plants that they eat, and particularly the woody species that we can track over time, began to stop growing above browse level.
With predators returning to landscapes, it definitely changes the way the ecosystem is and creates a balance that doesn't exist without them from a purely scientific and ecological standpoint.
Having healthy riparian vegetation is incredibly important for having healthy fish habitat. Those plants provide shade, they provide bank stability, they provide cover. It is important for fish habitat.
It actually did a huge detriment to the prey species, because then as you annihilate the predators, then the prey species become overpopulated, which creates overgrazing, and then that's when you have mass die-offs of the prey species because there's not enough food left anymore.
Predators often target the weakest and the old in ungulate populations, so they actually help those ungulate populations to be healthier.
If you're missing those key predators on a landscape, you'll end up with an exploding population of deer. But if you've got the full complement of predators on the landscape, they're pulling the sick and the weak out. And so that's keeping those herds strong.
Prey population, as it goes up and down, the predator population will go up and down in sync with that. So you get this balance that occurs where one doesn't wipe out the other.
Grizzly bears are nature's can opener. And I've watched, animals like coyotes, ravens, eagles, literally wait for a bear to come to a carcass because they can't do anything with it. I've watched ravens lure bears in to these carcasses to open up the can. And when they open up the can, then everything eats. And when everything eats, then the whole ecosystem is happy. And that's just one little tiny example of the many ways a grizzly can contribute to other animals and other things that are in the ecosystem.
The role of wolves, we think, is fundamentally important to these ecosystems because without them, the other predators don't seem to have the same kinds of effects. Bears are not effective at controlling elk populations. Cougar are not effective at controlling elk populations, but they're quite complicated. It's part of the food web.
Plants are going to establish, grow, trees are going to establish, that means beaver are going to return, that means songbirds are going to return, and so eventually you get to a point where you can actually see a difference in the course of a river based on the presence or absence of wolves. And so when we think about our choices and how we are going to coexist, that has to be part of the conversation.
I would think that all predators play a role. It's just that we're finding that these apex predators have a significantly more important role in what happens out there.
We're beginning to realize that predators are very essential to the ecosystem health. If we don't protect those areas, then the predator population is likely to collapse.
I think that people are very tolerant of the big predator species. However, they want them to be managed. They want to limit the number of depredations, the number of conflicts that occur.
Most people love wildlife. They love to get out in nature. They love to see deer. They love to see the predators when they're from a distance in Yellowstone, for example. The general public probably doesn't have a true understanding of what really is taking place. The general public looks at predators as kind of a vicious monster and inhumane in the way that they kill animals. If we were to stop every one of these predators from being inhumane, then I think we're looking in the wrong area. We've lost focus, we've lost sight of what's truly important and what we should be doing with our lives. Consequently, when someone comes up with false information and they make a really big deal about it, they have the tendency to sway the public to believe that. But I think that's a great opportunity for us to take that to them and really show and bring out awareness and really work hard to make it more understandable for people.
Those opinions are influenced by how you grew up, where you grew up, what's your experience with wild places. Do you come from a family of ranchers? Did you spend your entire life growing up in New York City where the largest animal might be a fox or a pigeon? So there are a lot of varied opinions based on what your life experience has been. And that's not right or wrong, that's just your life experience and influences how you react to those situations and how you react to the predators.
Science would play an important role in making decisions about how we manage or think about managing large predators on landscapes, whether we allow them to come back or not, and things like that.
Science is the justification of everything, really, anymore. Science is also quite boring. A lot of people don't want to hear it. We can learn a lot from the science of wildlife. So being able to relay it and educate people the right way so they want to listen and they're willing to listen is a super important responsibility.
It really requires the science to dominate decisions. But the question is, are we going to follow that information? Are we going to use the science? I think that's, the tension of our age. Scientists tell us that predators have important roles in ecosystems and that we can recover them, that we can live with them. Are we going to listen to that, or are we going to let prejudice essentially dominate how we do things?
The goal of science is to try to make decisions devoid of emotion, objective, rational decisions, and so to use that as a base, even though emotion will come into it, is always a good thing.
These are decisions that society ultimately has to weigh in on with values and opinions, and so it's not clear-cut, but it's important, though, that science become a component of those decisions, a very important component.
The federal government got rid of wolves, but now the federal government has recovered wolves, so somehow that's done them an injury. Now, values have changed. People want wolves and feel like we did it wrong by doing that. We should correct this wrong and put them back.
We think the North American model for wildlife conservation is the premier model worldwide. It's worked for over 100 years. It's because of that model that we have the terrific populations of animals that we have today. And it starts with the fact that people were willing to regulate themselves, to regulate their activities, to ensure that they weren't having such a negative impact on these populations that it was prohibiting them from growing and from prospering on the landscape.
People like myself, we're in the process of learning many things that we didn't know before and realizing that mistakes have been made in the past. Theories and hypotheses that were once considered valid are no longer considered valid. It's a rapidly changing field, so we have to adjust almost on a daily basis as to what our management goals are going to be. Things are changing so rapidly. There's so much interaction that, as far as what people think of as the natural ecosystem, those days are gone. We're into a new era where there's so much influence by human beings on our wildlife populations that if you want to talk about balance between predators and prey, it's a daily changing balance. And so I don't personally believe there really is a balance. And we try to manage them as best as we can to try to keep them from going extinct or being extirpated from a state or part of their range. But a lot of it is out of our control, and there's so many influences now on ecosystems that didn't occur before European man especially was here, and it's unlikely that we're going to reach some sort of long-term balance between our predators and prey. It has more to do than just public opinion about how we should manage them. All of us are very much interested in finding solutions and finding a good balance between people and wildlife and trying to prevent any sort of depletion in our species. We try to make management plans based on science for our different wildlife species. So we have a cougar management plan, we have a wolf plan, and we try to incorporate as much science as we can into that so that we can manage them properly. We are way better off now than we were with many of our wildlife species. But it doesn't mean that we don't face these incredible challenges.
You have to be adaptive and make changes, but also not be afraid to experiment with some things that might be a little bit different.
Management means one thing, killing. And most of the time, I believe it's unnecessary. I think it's often a political reaction to appease a certain constituent, such as the ranching community. And what's actually been shown through science is that just the opposite's happening, that cougars and wolves actually make the prey populations healthier, genetically stronger by weeding out the sick animals, essentially.
We've managed our forests kind of like they're deer farms or elk farms. We've done that around here even. That's because much of wildlife management is powered by the hunting community who buys licenses to harvest ungulates primarily.
Somewhere or another, you have to balance the numbers of predators and not let them outnumber your prey base. And that's where we got right now. We have literally got in Oregon in places where we have more predators in game units than I swear we have deer.
We have such a high population of predators that the ungulate population is being suppressed to an unsustainable level. And you introduce a new predator into that environment as well, that's going to also have their own fair share of that population. The hunters are afraid that we're going to be squeezed out of that equation.
There's the potential to see an imbalance in nature or an imbalance in the way that we look at wildlife and that we perceive wildlife. And both, I think, can be detrimental to the health of our planet, to the health of society. There's always instances where we don't know everything about nature, and so we're managing to the best of our ability, which is what we were doing back in the late 1800s or the 1900s when we had this extreme, huge predator control campaign that went across the country, and we killed millions of different types of species across the planet. All these species were pushed to the very brink of extinction. The concept of wildlife management has changed, and is it going to change again in the future? And that's to be determined.
We are the managers of the wildlife, held in trust for the people of Idaho. And so it's up to us as managers to provide good information for the policymakers to make the right decisions. We're just trying to inform people, to provide them good information by which they can make their decisions and shape their views. This is a difficult thing to do. Predator management is tough work. It's controversial by nature. It probably always will be. We're not out to eliminate predators. We're out to reduce those conflicts, but to keep that population sustainable.
The general public is very naive in this day and age about the science and the biological understandings of our wildlife species. And I think that education is absolutely a key for people to get together to try to find a common solution or the best management practices, if you will, to try to maintain our wildlife populations. It's very important to educate the public. The public seems to me to be losing real touch with wildlife and the outdoors in general.
Essentially, we brought wolves back so we could slaughter them all over again, yet the American public has been largely ignorant of that. All they essentially know is that certain states delisted wolves, that they returned and everything was okay. And so I think there's a great deal of ignorance out there as to what the reality is on the ground.
There needs to be more education, and I'm so glad for the groups and the organizations and people who are out there doing that.
Really educating them about the pros and cons and the value that our predators and the relationship that predators have with their prey interacts in the community, whether it's urban or rural. We've learned that educating the public on many things that they don't know goes a long way towards them understanding, and it helps these different opposing views come together and actually realize that what each other's values and opinions are. So we're always trying to find some sort of common ground so that we can manage these animals in a way that really benefits people and takes care of whatever problems we have.
As human beings, we're incredibly out of sync with nature. And whenever that happens, I think there's a backlash. I think there's serious ecological problems. It's very important for us to live in concert with nature, not try to fight nature, not try to manage nature. Every time we try to manage nature, it usually backfires.
Our mandate from the legislature is to preserve, protect, and perpetuate wildlife, but then also to maximize recreation, including hunting and fishing. If a species can handle a hunting season, we certainly are obligated, if you will, to consider that.
It's regulated by agencies such as Idaho Fish and Game. It works because people know that there are animals there to harvest, but those numbers are limited. It's not an open season anymore.
All of our wildlife species, predators and prey, are interrelated, and there's no question about that. You always hear people talk about individual species. And the biggest mistake that we could make is something that would drive any of our species to the point of extinction.
There are very few absolutes, and everything that we do will either have a positive or a negative consequence for another species. And sometimes one action has a positive consequence for one species and a negative consequence for the other.
But when hunting is used as a way of controlling animals, we find that typically the prey species or the ungulate numbers are much higher because there's this encouragement to grow as many elk and deer as possible for hunters.
We try to manage species in balance, and that includes predators and prey. In areas where we don't have many predators, we have prey species that get into trouble. It's not good for the predator, it's not good for the people that are making their living on the landscape. And so we have to try to manage to limit that occurrence from happening. When we can manage it properly, the level of animosity and the level of conflict drops. And that's good for people, and it's good for the predators.
The myth that we've been fed by wildlife management agencies, which are funded through hunting revenue, is that we need to control wildlife populations or they'll just reproduce and there'll just be too many animals. What science has showed us in published peer-reviewed research is just the opposite, that predators like wolves and cougars and bears actually control their own population.
All of these species interrelate. If you were to not properly manage your elk, for instance, the dramatic effects on our wolf population, cougars, our apex predators, there would obviously be some sort of very negative reaction. We recognize that all of our wildlife species play a role in the community. Some of them we would have no idea unless they were missing what the effects would be. We're not going to take that chance. That really is the goal, is to manage all of our wildlife species so that they do not go extinct. We are dedicated to trying to optimize their numbers, not wipe them out. So we have management goals and objectives for our different species. For instance, we don't manage for maximum numbers of just about anything. It's a constant balance. We are all dedicated to trying to preserve these wildlife and find a solution that doesn't necessarily have to be lethal.
It is definitely working. The depredations have dropped, the elk herds are beginning to show signs of recovery, and the wolves are still very sustainable on the Idaho landscape. And if something doesn't quite turn out the way we thought it would, then we can adjust. The end result is a good one. It's a positive result for wildlife in Idaho.
We do it to continue a tradition, to feed our families, and to enjoy the outdoors and have a connection with Mother Nature that the individual hiker or camper doesn't have. Hunter dollars and angler dollars are the major funders of conservation in this country. Without the resource for future generations, our lifestyle disappears. So we have a vested interest in protecting the resource.
One of the ways that we're managing wildlife right now, specifically wolves, is through hunting. And in several states across the nation, hunting is allowed on wolves.
Wolves are a big game species in Idaho. Just like elk, just like deer, just like black bear, just like mountain lions. They are a big game species, and we manage them as such. We're not eliminating wolves, we're managing them in a sustainable fashion.
There is controversy surrounding the wolf hunt. There are people who feel that the wolf hunt is, you can't kill enough wolves, and there are people who feel that you shouldn't be killing any wolves. So just with anything surrounding this predator controversy, there are two sides to the issue. And I think the goal of the managers is to try to find the best middle ground that they have and do what's going to be best for the ecosystem and the surrounding area.
Part of why they pushed for delisting is they wanted to hunt wolves, and that's what they've done. And in fact, Idaho in particular, their whole wolf management plan is designed to drastically reduce the wolf population.
Before Idaho and Montana started hunting wolves, there was a lot of concern, well, there's no way that you can manage their numbers, because if you just look at how prolific they can be and their dispersal distances and all those kinds of things, it's going to be very difficult to manage wolf numbers. And in fact, that's kind of playing out. A lot of folks have expressed a lot of frustration with how Idaho has been pretty aggressive with both hunting and trapping seasons, and then in some cases their own management activities to try to manage wolf numbers to benefit elk. And yet, if you look at actual population numbers, they really haven't knocked them back very far, even if they talk about what they want to do.
You have to manage them in a pragmatic fashion, you really do. You got to take action. In other areas where they're not having much of an impact, just let them go. Our hunters help us manage wolves. We probably sell 35,000 wolf tags every year. Of those, maybe 300 actually harvest a wolf.
And so can it be used to help you manage? I think so. And I think we'll learn more about that. Just like we have other large carnivores, cougars and bears, we've gotten a lot more sophisticated, I would say, in terms of how we use hunting to help us manage those species.
It's probably not the most scientific way to do it. There's a lot of research that points that when you hunt and you remove like an alpha male or an alpha female from a pack and you disrupt the breeding pair, basically, you are essentially allowing that entire pack to disband and become several different breeding pairs, which in turn creates more pups the next year, and now you have more wolves on your hands. So by hunting them down that way, you're almost increasing the population. So it actually has a tendency to increase depredation on cattle and sheep.
I think there'll be more and more science coming out about what really happens within the dynamics of a wolf family when there's heavy hunting involved. Some people believe that you have to hunt wolves in order to control their numbers. I would disagree with that, and maybe science will tell us something different, but because they're so territorial, you'll start to see them self-regulate and manage their own numbers.
When you let wolves just be, they're going to naturally tend to go towards their natural prey base. That, I think, is the best way to manage wolves, is to let them be.
Now, there are people on the other side who want the recreation of being able to hunt a wolf. That doesn't fit within my personal values. It fits into their personal values. So that will be a public conversation.
Wolves are part of the ecosystem. Eliminating them is not an option, and it's not anything that we're going to advocate for. What we are going to advocate for is the management of wolves, because they can, and have in other parts of the country, reduce the ungulate population to the point that sustainable harvest is no longer sufficient. For example, in Minnesota, they can no longer hunt moose. And the contributing factor on a scientific determination was that the wolf had a larger impact than they initially expected. And this was science by David Meach, which is actually was a pro-wolf advocate, and has since the initial reintroduction has taken a more balanced approach.
When you look at Idaho though, and what they do with wolf tags there, they sold 20,000 wolf tags last year. There were about 200 people that were successful. So you talk about hunt success rate, it's very low. They're gonna keep coming and coming and coming. There's nothing endangered about a wolf. The population continues to disperse and grow in the lower 48. This is going to be an issue that is not going to go away.
Wolves reproduce at a rate of 30 to 40% a year. They've done extremely well. We went from a few dozen wolves to well over 1,000 in just a short period of time. And as a result, they were beginning to have some major impacts. not only on domestic animals, but some of our prey species, specifically elk. Since that time, we've been hunting them, and the number of conflicts have dropped with people, and some of the elk herds are showing signs of improvements. In fact, many of them are, but there are still some that need some help.
The hunting of carnivores, the large predators, those apex predators, is controversial. For one reason, in their normal environment wouldn't have that kind of mortality pressure from a larger predator. They're it. So humans are that predator for those apex predators. There's a lot of dispute, even among the scientific community, whether hunting plays much of a beneficial role in controlling one species' numbers.
We're now killing more cougars in Oregon than were killed during the bounty era, and yet published peer-reviewed research shows that aggressive hunting of cougars actually leaves a population of very young animals, juveniles and subadults, and these are typically the animals that tend to be seen more often, prey on livestock, where it's the older, say, big male toms that hold territories are actually animals that control this young dispersers, as they're called, and often lethally control them. They'll kill them. And where we run into problems is when we think that we can manage these animals themselves.
I think that we traditionally and currently still make a lot of mistakes with managing wildlife because we as humans still cannot comprehend the very complex, intricate web of life. The principle thought in ecology is that everything is intertwined. We as humans understand that concept on the surface, but don't understand of all the ramifications of our management. There's always going to be a cascading effect somewhere down the line within the system. I don't know if we ever will fully comprehend that. In other words, the biotic world is far more complex than our brain will ever understand.
When human beings go out to hunt, say, deer or elk, they often target the best of the gene pool, the largest elk, the largest deer, the one with the biggest rack. It's very macho. Well, with predators like cougars or wolves, they actually have an ability to find the weakest animals, the genetically inferior animals. By preying on those species, they make that species stronger.
There's a benefit to having older age animals on the landscape. As the animals get older, they know how to navigate the matrix between people and how to avoid interactions. When you remove that older resident animal, 2 or 3 young ones move in and they all come into conflict with people.
A lot of folks, I think, equate hunting to be a competitor with predators. And I think that that's not a reasonable argument because wild predators are really hunting the easiest prey that they can find. Whereas human hunters are quite picky actually on what they select. Usually the most meat on the cow elk or the biggest rack on the bull elk. We're kind of only after certain select things with our prey species when hunting. As we decrease the prey population through human hunting, that puts more stress on the predators, and therefore predators have to increase their land area in order to try to find more food, which could very well push them towards humans.
These creatures are part of God's creation too, and I think they need that respect, that we need to see that they're part of our community and that really we should have a more holistic approach to how we live in this world.
What we're finding is leaving older aged animals on the landscape has a real value to it. What you're doing may actually have the reverse effect, and you may wind up with more complaints than you originally had. I don't think hunting is the answer for complaints.
There's this huge body of science, and a lot of it's emerging from, say, Washington State University Carnivore Lab, where it says the heavy hunting of cougars, you create this population of very young animals that get into trouble.
What you've altered is the age structure of the animal. Maybe there's more deer and elk on the landscape if we shoot as many as we can. Well, time after time after time we've shown, and studies have shown, and Idaho just finished a long 8-year, hundreds of thousands of dollars involved in this project, and at the end of it they said no change in the ungulate population. So we're always looking for that quick fix, but A lot of these things tend to be just a sliver of the bigger pie, and we need to be more inclusive in other arenas as we are in reduction of numbers.
Hunters are definitely the main component to wildlife management. They can issue increased level of tags and encourage individuals to be in certain parts of the state surrounding high agricultural areas to help suppress the ungulate numbers that are damaging farmers' crops. We could have an overabundance of ungulate population and a very low population of predators, possibly extinction. And it can go the other way, that if we continue to want to have hunting and we don't manage our predators, at some point we're going to have a prey base that is unsustainable and could also be at risk of extinction. The more hunters out there pursuing predators, the more success you're going to have regardless of the means, which is going to help an ungulate population that's being suppressed. Whether the wolf or the bear or the cougar was actually the cause of the decline of the ungulate or not, if the ungulate has fallen to an unsustainable level, those predators will keep the ungulate suppressed to that level. It will be very difficult for the ungulate to increase in population. So hunters can have an impact by going in and actively pursuing predators in that area to offer some relief to those ungulates.
Predators have a spot on the landscape too, but they have to be managed. And they are the active method for managing those species, and they're proud of that. It's not about trying to exterminate the species, it's about trying to manage it. And that's what hunters do, and they're very proud of what they do and their ability to help us control those various species.
All predators have a pack structure. That pack structure is what helps teach young coyote pups and wolf pups how to hunt, to be wary of the presence of humans. And when you start to take out adult coyotes and wolves randomly, you're also taking out the knowledge that they have and could be teaching the young animals, and then you're creating more problems in the long term. There's been a lot of sport hunting of wolves after delisting in 2011. We just had new data come out from the state of Idaho, which shows that the number of breeding pairs of wolves is going down. And I think, again, that probably reflects the selective randomness of shooting wolves. So you can kill a lot of wolves and disrupt packs, therefore reduce the number of breeding pairs.
So it actually has a tendency to increase depredation on cattle and sheep, which doesn't always work well for the rancher. It's a very intricate web there. When you let wolves just be, they're going to naturally tend to go towards their natural prey base. So that, I think, is the best way to manage wolves, is to let them be.
I think most folks are comfortable having wolves as long as they know they're managed. That's what it comes down to. People are beginning to recognize the wolves are doing all right. They're doing great. They're not being wiped out, as some have claimed, and that's a good thing. Those who want them controlled, I think they're pleased too in seeing the level of depredations drop. They feel like they're being listened to.
We get into problems as human beings when we try to manage species. I think we should spend much more time managing ourselves and protecting what we have left of the natural world. It's all disappearing very, very quickly. None of these populations just continue to grow indefinitely. They'll reach certain populations in areas where the habitat and prey is suitable and where they can survive. But those populations aren't static, they go up and down.
They regulate their own populations. One, they're limited by prey, and then they're highly territorial. So a pack will maintain a territory, and it'll maintain that territory size at the point that allows them to get enough prey. And other wolves that enter that territory get killed or chased off. So they self-regulating populations.
This whole idea that we need to control wildlife populations, apex predator populations, is a myth. And in regards to animals like with coyotes, it's backfired big time and cost us hundreds of millions of dollars because of how it's backfired.
Is it better to just kind of let nature take its course and leave it alone rather than try to fix it and change it? Some people would argue that it's better just to let nature do what it's going to do.
If you removed humans from the landscape, nature would take care of itself. There's no arguments about that, but humans are here.
So there has to be some sort of management because there are always going to be people on the landscape that have different opinions and different values and different needs.
Wildlife management can sustain a relatively flat level of population if they're allowed to manage wildlife to do so.
And so I do not envy the job of predator managers in this area. They have to consider all of those things very carefully and decide how much are we able to let nature take its course before it negatively impacts the human communities surrounding these wild spaces.
Few people dispute that there is a crisis that faces human beings. The world is facing many challenges based on our behavior. There exists old and new solutions that need to be balanced by contemporary scientific fact. But one thing is certain, as humans, we can't afford to do nothing. Based on the current science available and political and social environments, there's one essential question that humans have got to ask. Are we capable of living with predators on the landscape?
Predators do take cattle, they do take sheep, not just wolves, it's grizzlies, bears, and it's mountain lions or cougars up here in the northwest. Coyotes are one of the more prominent predators that take a lot of young calves and sheep. The whole perception of predators from the ranching community tends to be more towards animosity because these predators do affect their livelihood.
Just like with any other group, you can't generalize ranchers feel this way. It is up to the individual rancher. Have they experienced livestock issues? Have they not experienced livestock issues? What are their opinions and what are their backgrounds?
The ODF&W Commission had town hall meetings all over the state, knowing full and well that here in Wallowa County would probably be the first place in Oregon that would be affected by wolves. There were a number of concerns, mostly to do with depredations. Me, myself, at that time, I was the least bit concerned. I didn't think it would be any different than cougars, bears, coyotes, anything else that we had going on here. There was enough history and people looking across other state lines. There were people that knew that there was going to be problems with wolves.
If you was to take the old-time ranchers, probably in western United States, they pretty much run their ranches off of the 3S methods. They shoot, shovel, and shut up. If you had a problem out there, you shot it, you dug a hole, you got rid of the problem, you didn't have a problem anymore. And I'm sure some places that mentality still does exist. I have told the ranchers in this county that don't work here, because if you're going to go out here and use the 3S's when these wolves shows up, you're going to be in federal penitentiary.
Some ranchers, I'm sure, are very much anti-wolf. Some ranchers really work hard to work with non-lethal depredation techniques, and some ranchers know that wolves are on the landscape and never experience a problem, so it is really up to that individual person.
One of the issues with wolves that's different than other predators is if a cougar comes in here, she might slip in here, kill a calf, consume it, and you wouldn't be the wiser. A pack of wolves comes in here, they chase this entire herd. They get something tired and they drag it down. It doesn't affect just one animal, it affects the entire bunch. It's a fear that wolves put into cattle that we as ranchers couldn't replicate even if we wanted to.
I think the livestock industry is coming around very rapidly. Obviously, they need to protect their way of life, their business, and so they're finding their own ways as well to help prevent conflicts and deal with conflicts.
We have several ranchers, at least one that I can think of that's a fairly large producer that doesn't allow any coyote shooting on their place. In 60 years of calving on their place, they have never lost a calf to a coyote. Had a fairly symbiotic relationship where they drug their dead cows off in a pile and let them scavenge on them. And it's hard for people to understand that we have not just been active predator hunters here. We've got along pretty good. We need to come to terms with how we're going to deal with wolves. And when wolves become depredators of livestock, they need to be lethally destroyed. And that's a tough thing for a lot of people to consume. But that's the way that it's been successful in other places, and that's the way that it's going to have to be here. There's nothing endangered about a wolf. 60,000 of them in Canada and Alaska. The population continues to disperse and grow in the lower 48. This is going to be an issue that is not going to go away. We're going to have to come to terms with these are lethal animals and they need to be lethally removed from time to time.
If there's irrefutable evidence that those animals that are called predators are impacting ranchers' livestock, create a fund to pay for their losses. But I don't think that today, with people on almost every foot of the earth, it's going to be hard to separate nature from man.
We never raised these animals to be depredated on. That if wolves are going to be here, we're going to have losses. We need compensation, but it still doesn't make it acceptable for an animal to kill one of ours.
Maybe they lose one or two cattle to what they term predators, then maybe the government should give them a subsidy too for their losses.
It's nothing but sucker bait. We are going to pay you for the damages if you can give me a picture of a wolf actually cutting and wrapping these steak. And so they will pay you damages for a little while until these wolves get to the magnitude where nobody can afford to pay for the damages. Then it will all dry up and go away. And the people, the livestock community again, will be the one saddled with all the problems and the cost of it. That's where it's headed. You can mark my words on that one.
Certainly we cannot all be so greedy that money is the only thing we see when it comes to deciding who lives and who dies. Because every form of life has a right to be on this world, otherwise they wouldn't have been created. Certainly ranchers aren't dumb. Maybe they can say, I'm going to raise 500 cattle for sale, but this year I'm going to raise 550. That those 50 cattle are there to offset the cost if the wolves choose to take 1 or 2 or 3 of them for food. What keeps a rancher from doing that? Nothing. Any good businessman knows how to make your crops pay for itself, or any resource that you're putting up for sale. You have to know how to keep enough on hand in order to keep your business going. I think that's the same way it is in nature too.
There was never a time where we conceded that it was okay for a predator to take an animal. We do everything we can to keep these things alive.
Marin County, California decided to move its predator management program to a non-lethal methods-based program. And they've seen a 60% reduction in the amount of conflict with wildlife as a result of that. What we need to see are policies and laws and rules in place that require people to first resort to and exhaust non-lethal methods before we ever even consider lethal methods.
Wolves in particular are just an infinitesimal fraction of everything that livestock dies from. Domestic dogs, for example, kill a lot more livestock than wolves do.
As we continue to evolve and science continues to change and we come up with, there's new research, there are new things being revealed, we can change the way that we manage, and there are a lot of different groups trying to come up with new and creative ways to have anti-depredation for livestock owners and trying to work with them to come up with new ways. Okay, let's try this. Let's try this electric fencing. Let's try having guard llamas out with the livestock or guard dogs and see if this is more effective. So there are people doing that right now, and as that research comes to light, it can change the way that policy is done and the way that people coexist with predators on the landscape.
There was a study in Minnesota where they looked at the impact of killing wolves the next year. So if you kill or trap wolves in 1 year, is there less likelihood that you'll lose livestock in the next year? And they found that actually, no, there's not.
Now they got flaggery and they got cowbells and all this stuff to guard. These guys here, they turn their stock out and then they gather them in the fall and they put salt out and they move them in their pastures and stuff, but they don't sleep with them every night. They're going to have to sleep with them every night to keep them alive. You're going to have herders just like you had for sheep. That's why they was out there, to try to protect the sheep.
You fence the cattle during calving season. When they're turned out on public lands, you have a range rider. You can have different cattle breeds that act more like natural animals and bunch up.
Also the use of what's called fladry, which is like this stripping that waves in the wind, kind of like you'd see at a used car dealership, or putting that shiny fladry on electric wire. Those can definitely be effective. There have been people using things called howl boxes where they play recorded wolf howls to sort of try to convince wolves in the area that there's already wolves here. Having guard llamas out.
Don't work very well on cougar because that long neck gives a cougar a real place to get a hold of them, and so they will kill them and eat them. I've seen that quite a bit. The Pyrenees dogs the same way. I've seen Pyrenees dogs is killed by cougar and ate. These wolves, I'm sure, will massacre these Pyrenees dogs. As far as putting out sound objects, and I mean, I tried that out here on Skyward with sheep, put a radio on with the motion detector, the radio come on. It'd work for a little while. And then go back and it'd be a dead lamb right there, and the landowner would say, I think they like a little music with their meal. You know, it all works for a little while. And then they just get used to it, and then they'll come right in light with the propane cannons and go back to doing what they're doing.
Most important thing is human presence. There are far too many ranching operations where people get, I call them almost boutique ranches, where they'll get some animals and basically that's it. They pay very little attention to them. So if you're ranching sheep or cattle, you've got to invest time into doing it. And that will also oftentimes mean investing in a guard dog or several guard dogs or a guard llama. And during birthing seasons, just using common sense.
I hear of wolf-friendly beef, and I've heard some environmentalists say, you know, well, you know, everybody says that they're willing to pay a few more dollars for wolf-friendly beef and that sort of thing. I say, show me the money.
Predator-friendly programs are a new and exciting way of mostly private corporations and small businesses mostly that are finding a way to promote safe practices within agriculture, safe to predators, by passing along that cost of what it takes to raise animals in a predator-friendly scenario. The consumers have a direct effect on being able to promote predator-friendly agriculture. But right now we're seeing pilot programs that are successful, and people are actually able to promote predator-friendly agriculture through their purchasing.
Trap and relocation is often a death sentence to the wildlife. It depends on the species, but a lot of them die when they're taken out of their home and taken somewhere else. It's an ugly truth, and it's not a satisfactory solution in many cases.
We have to be aware of the many factors that affect their habitat, and we can't just say we're going to put them out in this area and try to retransplant them if we don't know if the ecosystem that we're transplanting them into is able to be conducive to their survival to be transplanted into that area.
The public, they will listen, especially if they know that the wildlife that's causing them conflicts is going to die if we have to really deal with it. I don't think that universally the opinion with rural folks is kill them and get rid of them. I run into many people in all walks of life that, hey, if I can give them a non-lethal solution, they're all for it. We solve people's bear problems all the time by just simply recommending electric fence. It depends on the species, but there's always some sort of solution, and a lot of people have reoccurring problems. Sometimes lethal solution is not the easy solution. If there's a way to permanently end the solution that's non-lethal, that is absolutely the way to go.
I think we're at a very interesting point in time. And I think what happens over the next several years will really determine that. I think it'll be a shame if we brought back wolves again to repeat the mistakes from the past. And that's certainly what's happened in Wyoming, Montana, and Idaho.
Whether it's, people who believe that humans first, we don't care if we want, there's animals going to exist, or I love animals so much I'm going to do everything I can to keep them around. The two similarities in both of those things are they're about them, not about the animals, usually. And that's bad.
Humans are incredibly selfish creatures. If we want to make the planet a suitable place for our future generations, our children, our grandchildren, great-grandchildren to exist in, then we better wake up and start preserving what we have left.
Oregon has an opportunity to really set itself apart. I don't ever want to see wolves hunted or trapped for sport in this state. I also feel the same way about cougars. I don't think we should be hunting cougars. I don't think we should be hunting coyotes or bobcats. These animals are critically important for ecosystems, and I think they have just as much right to be here as we do.
If people just learn to tolerate large megafauna predators and learn to not manage them according to our interests alone, if we change that attitude and realize that just let predators go to do what they need to do, then I think that's the beginning of us coexisting with them. And that's my hope, is to coexist with large predators. Not to praise them, not to put them on pedestals, but to simply live in harmony with them. And I think that's the goal that humans should have with all species.
There can certainly be harmony between humans and predators. We've lived alongside predators for thousands and thousands of years. We're still in existence today, and predators are still in existence today. So one hasn't killed the other off. So it's definitely possible.
I don't think I think much about nature being balanced. Nature is in constant flux. No matter what changes you see, systems will go on. They don't always go on in ways that humans like.
At some point, there will be boundaries or edges in the landscape where we say, enough is enough. And I understand that's a concept. But where we will allow wolves to live, we still have the question of how we will manage those. Will we provide protections to them, or will we make them just open season for anybody that wants to shoot a wolf?
I think what we need to focus on is that personal responsibility of what am I doing, how am I living, am I attracting, are my neighbors attracting, kind of work together to prevent these problems.
I would like to believe that there can be harmony between humans and wild predators. I think we have a long way to go to get there yet. And a lot of it is based on educating the humans about the necessities of carnivores, to educate humans about the absolute imperative notion of biodiversity continuing on this planet. I'm an opportunistic person, and I'd like to believe that harmony can be reached, but drastic changes need to happen quickly in order for us to get to that point.
A world without predators is it's not one that I'd want to be a part of. There's a reason we name our baseball teams and our football teams after these animals. It's because they personify power and will and tenacity. They're a good representation of what we should, of the wild, and the wild that we should keep here in North America and throughout the world.
If the world was without apex predators, nature would go away. It would be one giant city, that's it. But then it would be only a matter of time before everything failed. We would see the end of it all. The greatest predator to man is the lack of predators. It would consume us, and we'd be done.
We would not have anything that controls any of their prey species. Prey species would go crazy in their numbers, which would in turn create this world into pretty much a disaster and a mess.
You'd have an overabundance of ungulates, wild as well as domesticated. You would lose a lot of diversity of wild plant systems, and the vegetative structure would become a lot more homogeneous.
If we continue on this way, we will see them disappearing in landscapes. It's a worldwide issue that we're facing.
If predators would become extinct, then the prey would become overabundant, assuming they survive the same conditions that the predators weren't able to survive. They become overabundant, which then therefore would decrease the plant populations, therefore begin this catastrophic change within our system. Because if you don't have vegetation on the ground warms up, it dries out. It would take more and more water supply for us to irrigate our crops in order to make our own food. Eventually that water is going to dry up too, and eventually we have no food ourselves. Ultimately, the beginning of the extinction of the large predators begins a very slippery slope that eventually will end up in us succumbing to the same thing that they did. We have to have an optimistic attitude that we could find a solution. I don't think it's just one little thing we're going to do to solve this complex problem. I think we have to understand it first as a society before we tackle the end-all solutions.
We as human beings have the ability to do stewardship. It's kind of like a trust fund, essentially. You know, we have this pool of wildlife, this pool of nature and environment that's out there, and right now we have the ability to make sure that that stays preserved for generations to come. And if we over-abuse this trust fund of wildlife, of nature, then there's going to be nothing left for our generation, for our children or our grandchildren to be able to enjoy and to be able to go out in nature and actually see it the way it is.
The future of predators on the landscape depends largely on people getting good education. I think that's really important. And as science has developed, we've changed the way that we think about predators on the landscape. That's going to continue to change. And so as long as people continue to be open to that, I think that it could be a very positive future as we continue to work, and we might not get it right the first time, but continuing to change our thinking and adjust it.
One of the greatest things is the ability for us to learn and to get this information out there to people and allow them to experience things. You can learn more. Therefore, you have the ability to know the truth more than ever. So in this defiant, information-rich generations that are coming, I feel that they will realize the importance of the wild world, predators and everything involved, and they'll stand up for it.
Well, I'm pretty optimistic that the future holds a lot of great things for predators, especially looking at the way that wolves have recovered over the last 15 to 20 years. I think the perception is changing slowly, and I think it's going to continue changing.
I think that the trend is going to be to continue to allow predators to expand on the landscape. I think we're going to do better in the future.
We need that appreciation. We need that people appreciation, because without that, we won't have carnivores. We are very close to controlling everything in the world right now. If people do not want a particular animal to have a place in the world, it's gone. I have to look at the way that people think, and I think that people, by and large, are accommodating.
Understanding that they are beings on this planet that need something, like we do, I think people will change their ways, or be willing to change their ways a little bit. And that's all it takes.
It hasn't yet been a generation since we've had wolves back on the landscape, but I think, within a generation we'll see a really different viewpoint among even ranchers towards wolves as they live with them for longer. So it's one of those things where you just need that generational shift, and think we're on the crux of that, and we're going to see that happen.
I am not optimistic about predators growing on the landscape. I am optimistic, however, about sustaining the limited number of predators that we have now. If we were to keep what we have now, hopefully that is enough in order to sustain our system.
It's a fight that we're involved in every single day, but I think we will see wolves and bears and other predators in more places.
The wonderful thing and the scary thing about nature is that it doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen in a decade sometimes. Sometimes it happens in 100 years. In an experiment, you can do something, but you may not see the results in your lifetime. And to make a quick decision about what results you're seeing in that short period of time is foolish and doesn't jive with nature and the rhythms of nature. So whether we are doing the right thing or not, I don't know.
There is good evidence that humans can cause population declines in wildlife, and there's also good evidence that we can assist in recovery of wildlife. You know, as an individual, that makes me feel pretty good.
We can change our behavior. We have the mental capacity to change how we react and to change how we feel. The animals can't really change their behavior. It's very instinctive. So it is up to people to change the way that we behave and that we choose to interact with those animals.
I've seen about all the change that I can absorb. I've seen it change to where I'm about full up on change. I'm more of a traditionalist. I like things the way they were, and I don't like where it's going. So, end of story.
We have so much to learn. And I think part of that great experiment is realizing that we have a lot to learn yet. And that we should keep our mind open to change. We should keep our mind open to results when we see something positive. But remember that, you know, one thing that's true about nature, it's unpredictable. You know, it's dynamic, it's complicated. It's this machine that you can't learn. You will never be able to understand completely. And just being humble enough to realize that is part of what we need to do. And there's steps in the right direction. Whether it's honed in yet, no way. We have so much to learn. And to think that you understand and think that you have the ability to really change everything is very egotistical. I mean, you are. This is one of the most arrogant things you can say, because, yeah, we as humans can affect wildlife, but we're not going to do something that's going to change it. In fact, if anything is ever going to happen, nature is going to come back and get rid of us.
When you destroy an ecosystem, it's not going to rebound overnight. If we destroy it in the 200 years that man has come from the east into our country, it's not going to rebound overnight, no matter how much man helps it. But what we do have, we need to protect.
You can't make mistakes again. So what we have now is a knowledge of the mistakes that we've made and what we have in nature. And we have to consider all those. And that's the only choice we have. And it's that great experiment that we are living in, humans playing with nature, that may come out beneficial for both or may destroy it all. But we got to realize and take the responsibility that either of those outcomes can happen.
I can do research to perhaps tell you what the value of having wolves might be in an ecosystem, but it's up to you as an individual to decide whether that's worth it to you to have them around. And at some level, some people will say no, and at some level, some people will say yes. And we will somehow work that out over time.
So where do we go from here? We know that humans are not only capable of, but we're essential in solving some of the most complex of problems. Through vigilant scientific research and expanded and comprehensive educational outreach, we can work toward better solutions that answer some of these complex problems, not only for today, but for our future.
So this is Cash. He is one of 6 Karelian bear dogs employed by the state of Washington. They are our non-lethal solution to human-wildlife conflict. We use these dogs for a lot of different purposes. We haze bears away from people, and we come back and introduce them to the dog and tell them how to avoid negative interactions with wildlife, because there's always an attractant present. And so these guys are helping teach bears boundaries. They're helping to teach people about how to avoid these problems. Another way we use these dogs is treeing bear and cougar for research. And so Cash is 9 years old. He has 450 bear captures and about 130 cougar captures under his belt. He's the most decorated dog on the team. But all the dogs have really good skills. They come from the Karelia region of Finland, which is where they get their name, Karelian bear dogs, born and bred for thousands of years to hunt grizzly bears. And so we're using that natural ability, that tenacity, that intelligence for a good cause here in Washington, and that's human bear-cougar conflict.